That morning of December 27th, I woke up with the hope of organizing my plans for the new year. I grabbed my phone with the automatic gesture of someone expecting a simple, warm reply. I wrote to my daughter-in-law asking where we were going. Just a few minutes later, the screen lit up with a message that completely changed my mood. They were in Spain. And the cruelest part wasn't the physical distance, but the cold words that came with it. Only with the ones who really matter. It was as if every letter carried the weight of a brick, tearing down an entire wall inside me. My husband, my son, and my daughter-in-law, all together celebrating far away without even considering my presence. I felt something similar years ago, when a close friend organized a birthday party and conveniently forgot to invite me. It wasn't about the event itself, but about what that absence silently screamed, "You're not a priority." And in that moment, I realized that the deepest wounds don't come from declared enemies, but from the people you never imagined could hurt you. The ground seemed to vanish beneath my feet. My mind raced, searching for justifications. Maybe it was a last-minute trip, maybe a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew those words were chosen on purpose. They weren't just informative. They were a message, a statement. The feeling was like standing before a door you always thought was yours, only to have it slammed and locked in your face. And as painful as it was, something inside me whispered that this message wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger that I would still have to face. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to the Vintage Revenge Stories channel. We're building a community of incredible women who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now back to the story. On New Year's Eve, I sat in the living room watching fireworks through the window. I kept telling myself it was just a misunderstanding, that I would soon get a call or even a last-minute surprise. My husband had mentioned something about unavoidable meetings, and my son, when I asked about plans, gave such vague answers that I didn't press further. It's funny how, when we want to believe the best, our hearts build excuses to avoid facing reality. I prepared a small dinner more out of habit than hunger. I turned on the TV to feel some kind of company in the silence of the house, while holding my phone as if expecting a notification that never came. That night reminded me of a distant winter when I was trapped at home because of a snowstorm, and everything outside felt unreachable. The difference was that this time, the barrier wasn't made of ice, but of secrets and distances created by the people I loved. What I didn't know, or maybe didn't want to know, was that while I was spending midnight alone, they were toasting on the other side of the ocean. It was a trip planned for months, carefully kept secret, as if my exclusion was an essential part of the itinerary. It's strange to think that sometimes silence isn't the absence of words, but an entire plot being written without you. And it was in that silence that I unknowingly began piecing together the first clues of something that would change everything. Looking back now, I can see the signs were there all along, blinking red, but I chose not to see them. Since Thanksgiving, there had been something off. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, glances exchanged between them, and those enigmatic smiles that seemed to hide something. I could have questioned it more, but I preferred to believe it was just my imagination. After all, when we trust someone, we tend to convince ourselves that nothing bad could be happening. There was one particular day in late November when I overheard my son speaking quietly on the phone, and the moment he saw me, he changed the subject so quickly it was obvious he didn't want me to know. Even then, I swallowed my suspicion. It's like spotting a small crack in your wall and deciding to ignore it because it's nothing serious. But over time, that fissure widens and reveals a much bigger problem. The love I had for them blinded me to the possibility of any emotional betrayal. The small lies came disguised as plausible explanations. A meeting that ran longer than usual, a dinner cancelled without a convincing reason, text messages replied to with cold brevity. And I, clinging to my faith in family bonds, chose not to dig deeper. The irony is that often it's not the lack of signs that keeps us in the dark, but our own decision not to turn on the light. I had no idea that the darkness I was in was hiding far more than I could imagine. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a drop of water falling in the same spot until it wears a hole. My daughter-in-law, in a concerned tone, began saying I seemed tired, that maybe I was starting to forget things. At first, I laughed it off as an innocent comment. But little by little, those remarks became more frequent, always with that air of care that, in truth, concealed something else. My husband, instead of defending me, would reinforce the idea, confirming small mistakes I swore I hadn't made. That's when I realized how easy it is for someone to plant doubt in your mind. I found myself double-checking whether I had turned off the stove, replaying conversations in my head to make sure I remembered them correctly, writing down things I used to remember effortlessly. It was as if they were trying to convince me that my own mind couldn't be trusted. And when you start doubting yourself, you lose your balance and any outside opinion seems heavier than your own. Now I understand that this wasn't care, it was strategy. A quiet preparation to make me irrelevant so that, at the right moment, my absence would seem natural, even necessary. It's the same tactic I once saw an old colleague use at work. Subtly discredit an employee until everyone believed they were no longer fit for the job. Back then I thought it was cruel. Little did I know I would one day feel firsthand how such manipulation corrodes you without leaving visible scars. And the next stage of this plot was even more calculated. I remember the moment with almost photographic clarity. I walked into my husband's office to grab a book, and among some seemingly random papers, I saw 2 plane tickets to Madrid, dated exactly for New Year's week. My heart raced, not just because of the undeniable proof of a hidden trip, but because it triggered a memory. The documents he had tried to get me to sign just days earlier, claiming they were just bureaucratic adjustments. At the time, something in me refused to sign without reading. Now I realize that refusal might have saved me from something much worse. That discovery made me see that this wasn't just about being left out of a family trip. The silence, the lies, the manipulations, they could all be connected to something far more deliberate. I remembered how meticulous he had always been with finances and how, in recent months, he had avoided letting me see certain accounts and statements. It was as if he were building a financial wall, making me more dependent on him with each passing day. And if there's a way to imprison someone without chains, it's by taking away control of their own money. At that moment, I understood I had to start looking at everything with new eyes. What seemed like a simple trip without me might only be the tip of a much larger, carefully crafted plan. It was like spotting the tip of an iceberg. The visible part wasn't nearly as terrifying as knowing there was something massive and dangerous hidden beneath. And I knew that to face it, I'd have to be more strategic than ever, and that the next revelations would not be easy to handle. When I finally grasped the scale of what was happening, I no longer felt sadness, only a sharp sense of alert. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called my financial advisor with a coldness I didn't even know I had. There was no more room for hesitation or waiting for explanations. Within hours, every call, every click on the computer, every password change was a step toward reclaiming what was mine. This wasn't revenge, it was survival. I went to the bank in person, looked the manager straight in the eyes, and explained what needed to be done. The inheritance I had received from my parents, and the fruits of years of hard work, were in my name, and I would not allow them to be used against me. I made strategic transfers, closed shared access, and reorganized investments so nothing could be moved without my authorization. I felt a quiet relief knowing that, in just a matter of hours, 70% of my assets were safe. That's when I realized something powerful. When you take control, the narrative changes. No matter how much they tried to paint me as fragile or forgetful, there I was, making quick, assertive decisions. It's like turning around a chess game where your opponent thinks they've already won, but you still have key pieces on the board. And as I finalized those last transactions, I knew my next move would have to be even more calculated. When I discovered that transfer, I felt a mix of shock and disbelief. 6 months earlier, without me having the slightest idea, $20,000 had left my account, directed toward buying my son and daughter-in-law's new car. Every detail seemed calculated, from the signature he managed to obtain to the timing of when the documents were processed. The most ironic part was that, during all that time, they were still asking me for help with small overdue bills, as if I were disorganized or incapable of managing my own money. It was as if I had been living in 2 parallel realities, one where I believed in my family's good faith, the other where they were already manipulating and draining my assets without me noticing. I remembered similar situations, when friends or relatives asked for a small favor, and ended up taking much more than I ever imagined. That feeling of being used, even by those we love, cuts deep, as if every gesture of trust had been turned into a weapon against me. That moment made me see clearly how financial control is a silent form of power. It's not just about money, but about who decides what has value, what is allowed, and what isn't. Without realizing it, I had given a gift that cost me dearly, not only financially but emotionally. And deep down, A persistent voice inside me told me I needed to build even stronger defenses before the next surprise arrived. I remember the vibration of the phone on the table, and when I answered, hearing the desperation in his voice. My husband was calling from Spain, distressed because the credit cards weren't working, unaware that it was simply the consequence of my actions, not a mistake on his part. For a moment I felt a strange mix of power and sadness. I was on the other side of the world, yet fully in control of a situation that had once crushed me. When I began to question him, seeking explanations or even an apology, he only minimized everything. "Just a small trip," he said, "family time." It was astonishing how he tried to paint reality as something innocent, when in truth the omission and manipulation were crystal clear to me. I could have felt confused or insecure, but not anymore. In my heart I already knew it all. Every document, every transfer, every gesture that once seemed casual now fit together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. And while he tried to justify and downplay the gravity of his actions, I realized the real confrontation wasn't just about the trip or the cards. It was about who would finally have control over the narrative and the respect within this family. When I finally asked to speak with Rachel, I felt a mix of determination and calm that I hadn't felt in months. She answered with that rehearsed smile, trying to sound sweet, as if she could soften everything with gentle words. "I thought you'd rather stay home," she said, almost as if it were an innocent excuse. But I was no longer vulnerable to her subtle manipulations. Every word rang hollow in the face of what I knew. I took a deep breath and let the truth out, steady and firm. I explained that it wasn't just about suspicions or hurt feelings, but about concrete facts: tickets, transfers, documents, and calculated behavior. Every detail was recorded, and I had complete control of the financial situation. For the first time, I felt the real power of being prepared, of not depending on anyone's goodwill to protect myself. The tone of the conversation shifted instantly. Rachel realized the game had changed, that her attempts to manipulate me would no longer work. I didn't need yelling or dramatic confrontations. The strength was in the clarity, in the preparation, and in the certainty that I would no longer be underestimated. And as the call came to an end, I knew this was only the beginning of a new dynamic, one where authority and respect would finally be balanced. The feeling that took over me was strange, almost paradoxical. The pain that had once paralyzed me was now replaced by a cold, calculated strength, as if every tear had been transformed into strategy. I realized that all the suffering I had endured, every lonely night, every doubt, had prepared me for this moment. It was no longer about being hurt or excluded. It was about taking control of the situation with clarity and precision. They believed I was a lonely, naive woman, someone who would passively accept everything decided without my input. They underestimated my memory, my sense of justice, and most of all, my ability to act when the situation demanded it. And it was exactly that mistaken perception of me that gave me the upper hand. Every move I made from that point forward was thought out, calculated, like a chess match where each piece I moved was one step ahead of them. As night fell and I reflected on everything that had happened, I felt a mix of relief and empowerment. The game that once seemed lost was now in my hands. They would finally understand who they were dealing with. Not the woman who could be ignored or manipulated, but a silent strategist, capable of turning any situation to her advantage. And even with this newfound power, I knew there were still steps to take to secure this victory completely. I remember the moment I finally made that call as if it were yesterday. My voice was steady but controlled as I confronted my daughter-in-law and my son about the $20,000 taken from my account without my consent. Every word I spoke carried the accumulated tension of months of deceit and manipulation. At first they tried to disguise it, minimize it, even call it a gift, as if that could erase the seriousness of what they'd done. But I could no longer accept deceiving myself or being deceived. The sense that my trust had been betrayed turned into clarity. That money wasn't just an amount lost. It was the line marking how far I would allow myself to be manipulated. Without hesitation, I acted immediately. I called the bank, closed accounts, canceled cards, and blocked any financing linked to their trip to Spain. Each action was a firm step toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. In that instant, I felt both relief and power. It wasn't just about money. It was about taking control of my own life, my own assets, and the respect I deserve. That phone call was more than a conversation. It was the first clear statement that the narrative had changed, and from that moment on, I would set the rules of the game. And as I hung up, I knew every decision I made that day would have deep and lasting repercussions. It was a turning point in my life. After decades of living as the understanding wife and the ever-accommodating mother, I finally made decisions with only myself in mind. Every action I took, changing passwords, blocking financial access, reorganizing my accounts, was a silent reminder that for the first time I was putting my needs and my safety first. The sense of freedom was immediate and intense. Knowing that what was mine was protected, that my choices had weight and no one could manipulate them anymore, brought me a peace I hadn't felt in years. It was as if I had discovered a superpower, the ability to set clear, non-negotiable boundaries without guilt or regret. And with each adjustment I made, I realized the blind trust one had once given to others was now placed entirely in myself. They needed to finally understand that nothing would ever again be taken for granted. Every gesture, every changed password, every step I took was a silent but powerful declaration of autonomy and respect. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was acting for myself, and that awareness opened the way to a new dynamic, where the lead role in my own life finally belonged to me. When I met with my lawyer, I went in with a mix of apprehension and hope. I needed someone who could look at the situation without the emotional weight I was carrying. And as I heard her words, I felt a powerful confirmation. I was a victim of financial abuse, even from within my own family. This wasn't just my perception. It was real, documented, and legally recognized. The relief came with the certainty that everything I had done so far was within the law. Recovering the money taken without my consent, changing passwords, reorganizing accounts. All of it was not only allowed but necessary for my protection. The feeling that I was acting correctly gave me a confidence I hadn't felt in a long time, as if every carefully planned step finally had both legal and moral backing. She even suggested one extra step, a medical evaluation to certify my mental competence. At first, it sounded excessive, but I quickly understood the strategic importance of it. It was a way to shield my credibility, to show that my decisions were rational, deliberate, and legitimate. And when I left that meeting, I realized I now had the tools not just to protect myself, but to face any future attempt at questioning or manipulation. It was as if a fog had been lifted from my life. A manipulation so subtle it could have gone unnoticed by anyone. They had begun planting small hints about my memory, about my ability to make my own decisions. Every comment, every concerned gesture seemed innocent, but I recognized the pattern. They were trying to paint me as incapable, ready to be sidelined. The subtlety of the strategy was impressive, but I was determined not to be a silent victim. In that moment, I realized that their manipulation wasn't just psychological, it was strategic. Their goal was clear: to strip me of control over my assets, undermine my authority, and turn my life into something they could manage at will. That's when I decided to act proactively. I immediately requested an independent assessment by qualified professionals, to have concrete proof of my mental clarity and my ability to manage my own resources. While waiting for the results, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Every step I took now was calculated to strengthen my position, not just emotionally but legally. It was like placing pieces on a chessboard before my opponents even realized the game had changed. By the end of that day, I knew I would no longer be manipulated in silence. Every move I made would be visible, legitimate, and undeniable. The sense of control swept over me like never before. I reorganized all essential household payments, ensuring that every bill was covered solely with my money, without relying on anyone who might try to manipulate or control my life. It was a quiet yet powerful way to show that I was now setting the rules in my own home. As I adjusted every detail, I understood the full impact. If they depended on me to maintain the lifestyle they were used to, they would have to completely rethink their behavior. It was a practical lesson, wordless but unmistakably clear, ensuring that any future attempts at manipulation would be immediately recognized. Every transaction I made became a strategic warning, a reminder that the dependency had shifted. And then, digging deeper, another surprise emerged. My son was behind on his mortgage. That confirmed even more that I could not trust blindly, and that my role as the guardian of the family's financial stability and assets was inevitable. Every discovery made me feel more prepared, more grounded, like someone who finally controls the board, knowing exactly which pieces to move and when. The contrast between the situation and my feelings was almost ironic. While my daughter-in-law cried desperately because the trip to Spain was interrupted, I couldn't help but recall her cold words. excluding me from Christmas as if I were irrelevant. Those memories hit hard, bringing a sense of justice that required no shouting or confrontation to be felt. I called my financial advisor, keeping my composure, and confirmed that the amount they had taken could, indeed, be deducted from the inheritance or even reclaimed. This was not just a financial action. It was a silent declaration that everything has limits, and abuse of trust has consequences. Every word I exchanged with him was deliberate, ensuring I had legal backing to act if necessary. The feeling of silent power and justice was overwhelming. I didn't need to punish with violence or exposure. The truth was on my side, recorded and protected. Listening to my advisor, I realized that every step I had taken in the past months not only safeguarded my assets but also began to expose the hypocrisy and manipulation that had previously gone unnoticed. And I knew there were still chapters of this story that would need to be faced with the same firmness. When I finally picked up the phone to call my sister, I felt a mix of relief and nervousness. After so many years without sharing such deep details, I opened my heart and told her everything. The manipulations, the lies, the financial secrets, and the feeling of being sidelined by my own family. Every word I spoke was a catharsis, but also an important step toward regaining trust in someone close. She listened attentively and in the end reminded me of something our mother always said, with simple yet profound wisdom: trust but verify. In that moment I felt the weight of that phrase, which I had often underestimated. I had been trusting too much, accepting explanations and gestures of goodwill without ever truly looking at the details or seeking concrete proof. The lesson was clear. Trust is not the same as naivety. The conversation with my sister brought clarity and a renewed sense of responsibility. It was time to act with care and attention without allowing blind trust to put me back in a vulnerable position. That advice resonated deeply, as if it were the guiding thread finally allowing me to transform all the pain and deceit into strategy, protection, and wisdom for the future. I sat down with paper and pen, something I hadn't done in a long time, and began listing what I truly wanted for my life, without considering anyone else's expectations or desires. It was liberating to realize that there were desires of my own that I had set aside for decades, always putting others first. Every item I wrote was like a brick laid to build my own path, one that no one could dictate or control. One of the desires that emerged strongly was finally planning a trip to Italy, something I had always dreamed of, but my husband had never wanted or encouraged. I imagined the wines, the cobblestone streets, the small trattorias, and the feeling of freedom I had always associated with that place. For the first time, it was something entirely mine. A journey designed for me, guided by my own wishes, not by someone else's convenience or expectation. And as I pictured every detail of the trip, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control over my own future. It wasn't just about traveling. It was about recognizing that my choices have value, that my desires matter, and that I could finally be the protagonist of my own story. It was a light but powerful feeling, giving me courage to continue planning the life I had always deserved. When they finally returned from Spain, I felt a mix of calm and determination that I had never experienced before. I faced my husband, my son, and my daughter-in-law with the firmness of someone who had everything documented, all the evidence in hand. I showed every ticket, every transfer, and every document that confirmed the plan to exclude me from decisions and manipulate my assets. Every gesture, every look from them no longer intimidated me. I was ready to confront the truth. I demanded clear explanations about the trip, the expenses, and the strategy to declare me incapable of managing my own life. There was no room for excuses or minimization. Their silence spoke louder than any words, and the sense of power was indescribable. Every pause, every hesitation confirmed my suspicions, showing that I had been right all along, and that my perception had been accurate from the start. It was in that moment that I realized something essential. Strength doesn't come from anger or revenge, but from clarity, preparation, and certainty that no one can manipulate your life without consequences. I didn't need to shout or punish. The simple act of exposing the truth with confidence and precision was already shifting the entire family dynamic. And as I held my gaze firmly on them, I knew the next step would be even more decisive. When I delivered my ultimatum, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. I made it perfectly clear that reconciliation would only be possible with respect, honesty, and inclusion in all family decisions. Every word came out firm, without hesitation, as if each syllable marked a boundary they finally needed to acknowledge. There was no room for excuses or empty justifications. The responsibility was now theirs. When I stated that, if they didn't honor these terms, I would seek my own happiness outside that family, I felt a weight lift off my chest. It was the first time in years that my voice held such power, that my needs and limits were recognized, even if only by myself. The silence that followed wasn't intimidating. It was a silent acknowledgement that I had changed the dynamic and that my autonomy could no longer be ignored. And for the first time I experienced profound peace. I realized that I matter, that my worth doesn't depend on the approval or behavior of others, and that I deserve to be treated with the respect I should have always been given. The sense of self-sufficiency and control over my own life was transformative, and I finally understood that true happiness begins when you put yourself first without guilt or fear. When I met Thomas, Rachel, and David in the kitchen, a wave of determination coursed through me. I looked each of them in the eyes without fear and made it clear that I would no longer be treated as irrelevant. Every word I spoke carried months of frustration, pain, and acute awareness of everything that had happened. It was the first time I had set boundaries so firm and visible without raising my voice or begging for respect. I demanded honesty, respect, and accountability for every lie, every manipulation, and every attempt to exclude me from family decisions. These weren't just emotional complaints. They were demands grounded in truth, documents, and evidence I had gathered. Their silence spoke as loudly as my words. They finally realized I would no longer tolerate any behavior that diminished my value or authority within the family. The feeling that washed over me was one of power and freedom. For the first time, I realized that my place and my voice truly mattered, and that no one could ever silence or diminish me again. Every glance, every gesture in that moment reminded me that I had changed the game, and from that point on, the family dynamic would have to adjust to my determination and to the respect I had finally earned. When I announced that there would be no more gifts, loans, or credit cards covered by me, I felt a sense of power I hadn't experienced in years. Every word was a declaration of independence, a silent reminder that my generosity would no longer be exploited. For the first time, I set clear, non-negotiable boundaries without needing to apologize or justify my decisions. I gave David a deadline to return the money that had been taken without my consent, and I gave Thomas time to reflect on our marriage. Each deadline was not just a practical measure but a symbolic one. I was establishing rules for my own life, making it clear that I would no longer tolerate abuse or manipulation. It was an act of firmness that spoke volumes without unnecessary words, signaling that my patience had limits. In that moment, I felt that I had finally regained control of my life. The sense of autonomy and power was liberating, as if every decision I made was a brick rebuilding my emotional and financial freedom. For the first time, I understood that setting boundaries is not selfish. It's an essential step to protect what is yours and affirm your own value. When I realized that Thomas would not give a clear or honest answer, I felt there was no more time for small steps or hesitation. I called my lawyer and filed for divorce, determined not to delay my freedom for another minute. At 67, every moment mattered, and I knew I deserved to live without manipulation, lies, or anyone controlling my life and my assets. The process moved quickly, almost as if justice recognized that this was more than a simple divorce. It was the restoration of my autonomy and dignity. Every document signed, every step completed, brought me closer to the sense of peace I had been seeking for so long. The weight of manipulation, betrayal, and exclusion was beginning to lift. In the end, I reclaimed not only my assets but my freedom and my power to make decisions. For the first time in many years, I felt that my life was truly in my own hands. The sense of autonomy was so intense that, although the journey had been painful, every challenge I faced now felt like a step toward a new chapter, full of possibilities and choices that were entirely mine. What had started as 2 weeks planned in Italy quickly turned into 3 months of adventure and self-rediscovery. Every city visited, every coffee sipped in sunlit squares, was an opportunity to reconnect with myself, far from the expectations and obligations that had defined me for decades. For the first time, I felt that my time and my choices belonged entirely to me, and the feeling was liberating. I learned to live without rushing, to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, to make unexpected friends, and to allow myself experiences purely for the pleasure of feeling them. Every conversation with locals, every stroll through historic markets and streets, reminded me that there was a whole world to explore, and that my happiness didn't need anyone's approval or presence. For the first time, I was selfish with my time, and I loved every minute of it. I discovered that prioritizing my desires is not selfish but an act of self-love, and allowing myself to live this way gave me energy, joy, and clarity about who I truly am. It was as if every step on Italian soil was also a step inward, revealing a renewed, independent, and happy woman. When I received a call from David months later, I felt a mix of surprise and caution. He began to apologize, admitting his mistakes and saying he was getting divorced, as if he wanted to rebuild our relationship. For a moment, the old part of me, the one that always sought reconciliation at any cost, tried to focus only on the emotional side, but experience had taught me not to act impulsively. As he spoke, I stayed calm and listened carefully, absorbing every word without losing control. I could feel the weight of his apologies and his intent to make amends, but I also knew my life had changed profoundly. It was no longer about forgiving and forgetting as before. It was about recognizing boundaries and preserving my own stability and well-being. By the end of the conversation, I made it clear that I would no longer be the same person who always sacrificed for others. My patience and my heart remain, but now guided by self-respect and the certainty that my happiness doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or behavior. For the first time, I felt that my emotional authority was intact, and that any future relationship would need to be built on honesty and equality. When I sat down to talk with David, I was direct and firm. I explained that, from now on, our relationship needed to be based on respect, tangible actions, and responsibility. Empty words or generic apologies would no longer have a place between us. I needed to see real commitment, not just promises. I made it clear that I would no longer accept the old dynamic of blaming Rachel for everything or justifying behaviors with flimsy excuses. Every action he took had to be intentional, showing that he was willing to change and take responsibility with maturity. It was a test but also an opportunity for reconstruction, and I wanted it to be genuine. As I spoke, I realized that, for the first time, I felt completely in control of the rules of the relationship. He could choose whether he wanted to be part of my life, but he would have to prove it through consistent actions. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about mutual respect and clear boundaries to ensure I would never again be manipulated or underestimated. When I returned home, I felt the need to transform my physical space to reflect who I had become. I rearranged the furniture, planted flowers that genuinely brought me joy, and began reconnecting with old friends I had neglected for years. Every gesture was a silent declaration that I was now putting my needs and desires first. I declined meetings with Thomas and ignored Rachel's calls, not out of anger but out of clarity. I had learned that not every relationship is worth preserving. My energy and my time were precious, and I needed to invest only in what strengthened me and brought me joy. Every refusal became an act of self-love and boundary setting, something I had never done with such conviction before. As I rediscovered my space and my relationships, I realized I was creating a new chapter in my life. A chapter where my choices didn't need to please anyone, where my happiness was a priority, and where I could finally live on my own terms. It was liberating to feel that, after so much time, I was truly choosing myself. I sat in my kitchen, bathed in soft sunlight, with a warm cup of coffee and a book in hand, and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: true freedom. It was a feeling of richness that no money could buy, born from the recognition that I was finally my own priority. Every sip of coffee reinforced the truth that I had achieved something far greater than material possessions: my autonomy and inner peace. They tried to erase me, to reduce me to an irrelevant figure, but ironically, it was they who ultimately freed me. Every act of manipulation, every exclusion, and every attempt at control became lessons in strength, pushing me toward a place where I could finally recognize and value myself. It was as if every shadow from the past had dissipated, leaving only light, clarity, and personal power. And for the first time, I realized that the person who mattered most in my life was me. I didn't need anyone's approval, justification, or permission to be happy. Every choice, every small act of self-care became an act of self-love, and the feeling of being the protagonist of my own story was so intense that nothing could erase or diminish that moment of fulfillment. Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. And if this story made you reflect, like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow more real and powerful stories like this one. Because in the end, every story is an opportunity to see life through new eyes.